Welcome back to Cognitive Processes. In this lecture, which is chapter 4, I'm going to talk about attention. And this is the idea of a cognitive process that helps us deploy cognitive resources. So we've all had the experience of learning how to drive, paying attention to all the things on the road and all the things in a car just was so overwhelming when you were a new driver. But then as you became more and more experienced, you were able to monitor all the stimulus on the road, all the information in the car, and you became very much a practiced driver. So there's a lot of things going on when we pay attention. And researchers have figured out all kinds of things about attention that we'll talk about in this lecture. So here's a picture of Park City, Utah. I was there one summer on vacation. And we parked in the parking garage and we walked down this alleyway. And all of a sudden, I saw this picture on the wall, this beautiful piece of artwork just in this alleyway. And it turns out that I had discovered that this was Banksy. And this piece of artwork is called Cameraman in Flower. And this was painted on an alleyway in Park City, Utah during the 2010 Sundance Film Festival. There's a frame over the piece of artwork to protect it. So that's what that frame is around the piece of artwork. And I think a lot of artwork, Banksy's artwork is a very good example of this, where a lot of artwork is trying to draw our attention. And as we have our attention drawn to this piece of artwork, it makes us think. So this is sort of an important part of attention, is that attention isn't just, oh, I'm going to deploy resources over this area so I can do this task. Like it's actually pulling in all the cognitive processes that allow us to think. And artwork is like that. It makes us not only look at it, but it makes us think about what it means, makes us think about what we are personally thinking about this piece of artwork and what other people might want to think about. This piece of artwork, I don't know if you can see it really easily, but the cameraman is pulling the flower out of the ground. And so by the process of getting the film, the cameraman is actually ruining the beautiful flower because it's going to kill the flower by pulling it out of the ground. So there's all these like nuanced interpretations. And so that's what I want you to think about when you think about we're paying attention to something. Obviously, we need to pay attention to do deep processing, very detailed thinking. Okay, so selective attention is the idea of how do we focus our attention on one task when there's so many other things going on around us. When I walked down that alleyway in Park City, Utah, I could just ignore that painting on the wall. In fact, as I was walking from the parking garage, I think there were a lot of people in the alleyway walking with us that didn't even see it and wouldn't have realized that they were walking past this famous piece of artwork because it's just an alleyway. So how is it that we focus our attention on one task when there's so many other places that we can focus our attention? So one way researchers have done this in the laboratory is to create what is called a dichotic listening task. And this is when a research subject is putting on headphones, but the headphones have a different message going on in each ear. So one ear has one message and another ear has another message. And they are asked to shadow or repeat what is going on in one ear and ignore the other. So think about being in a busy room or sitting in the cafeteria at lunch. You have information that you're listening to in the conversation that maybe is in front of you, but you also are sometimes overhearing the conversation beside you at another table. And so, you're focused on one thing, but you're probably picking up information from the other ear. So one of the theories of how we do this is called a bottleneck theory. And this is the idea that we filter one message and that's the message we're going to process. And that selection occurs really early. Like we really aren't hearing the things that are outside that selected message. And definitely before meaning is processed. So it makes sense that we can only pay attention to so many things at once. So we focus on something and that's what we pay attention to. And then everything else that's going on in the world, we just ignore it. The problem is that when you do a dichotic listening task like this, what you find is that there is little bits of information that do pop in. It's called the cocktail party effect because it kind of like it's like being in a cocktail party. If you're in a party and you're talking to somebody, you're having a detailed conversation, but somebody says your name, immediately your attention swings over to that other part of the room. Somebody said my name, right? That shadowing gets disrupted when the listener hears the name, even though it's in an unattended message. So in other words, it can't be a full filter. There must be things coming in, and things that are meaningful to you probably seep in more easily. So the alternative explanation of how attention works is that it is attenuated. In other words, unattended messages are not completely blocked, but we definitely turn down the volume on the unattended message so that we can pay attention to the attended message. That is really what we need to pay attention to in that moment. And selection is based at least partly on meaning. So if you were listening to a conversation with a person and you were fully paying attention to them, but you heard your name or something meaningful to you, like say you're a soccer player and you hear somebody talking about a soccer game that is a team that you've been following, or something like that, and anything meaningful to you, then your selection for that information may quickly shift over to that other thing that is meaningful to you for that brief moment in time, because it makes sense that you turn down the volume, but even though the volume is low, you can still hear a little bit of it and it gets through. Another idea is a spotlight metaphor, and this is Kahneman's view of attention as a resource. So this approach, this idea is that we move a spotlight around. So, if you have a message you're paying attention to, a conversation that you're paying attention to, something you're focusing on, then your spotlight is on that. But the spotlight can highlight more than one object at a time or focus on just one thing, and it can move pretty easily. So if I'm walking down the alleyway and I had no intention of looking at artwork today, it's not really that important, but I'm walking down this alleyway and then suddenly I see this really beautiful painting on the side of a building that I wasn't expected. My spotlight might quickly shift over and look at that. And then in fact, if I feel like that painting is super interesting, I can really focus all my attention on that painting by the spotlight having moved to it. Other ideas are schema theories. And Neisser is one that says we don't filter or attenuate unwanted material. This idea is that we never really acquire it from in the first place. And you think, well, that sort of negates everything that we've just talked about. But the interesting thing is you can do studies and very strange, unexpected events can be presented to subjects and they never even notice. I'm sure you've had this experience yourself. You're, in a situation, you're taking the subway somewhere, or you're walking down a path and you run into somebody and you never really, they said, "Did you see that?" And you're like, "What are you talking about? I didn't see it at all." Some unexpected event happens and you had like no notice of it. Maybe you were paying attention to your phone more than, what's going on around you, things like that. So here's an example. This is a study from 1975, and it was a study that looked at two films superimposed. Participants were asked to do one thing. They were asked to follow the film footage about people counting hand slaps or ball passes. So they had to count. So, imagine there's a ball being passed among various people, and so you had to count the number of times the ball was tossed, and that was your job in the task. Now, what they did is they superimposed an unexpected event in this situation. And, they could put something unusual and you ask them, was this there? And they're like, "I don't know what you're talking about." They would count accurately. They would get probably pretty good estimate on the number of ball passes, but the other thing unexpected would be totally missed. Inattentional blindness is like this. So imagine that you're watching a scenario and you're counting, a white or black team passing a ball, and then you have somebody walk through with an umbrella, or even more crazy, you have someone walk through in a gorilla suit. If the person is counting the balls, even though this really strange, unexpected event happened, like someone walking through in a gorilla suit or carrying an umbrella, they just, you ask them if anything unexpected happened, they just said no, never even saw it, never even saw it. Also, change blindness, those experiments are so fascinating for the same reason. So imagine that you're watching a scenario where someone is stopping to ask for directions. Okay, so a subject is interacting with somebody asking for directions. And then there's like this intervening event, like in this case, in picture B, someone walks through with a giant board that blocks the identity of the person asking the directions. When the barrier walks through and gets changed, and you ask about the identity of the person who is the Confederate in the experiment gets switched to a different person. And then the person finishes the conversation about the directions, and you ask them, did anything unusual happen here? They don't even realize that the person they were talking to is not the same person anymore. That movement of the barrier in between the middle of the conversation and the switching of the people, didn't even notice. And that's called change blindness, where you have like a really distinct change, completely blind to it. It's not blindness from the vision perspective. This is attention, that the attention didn't pick up on the change. Really kind of fascinating kind of studies if you think about it. So in attention, obviously, we can pick up on things that are unexpected, but we can also totally miss crazy, things that are changing in our environment. Can we also divide our attention? So can we learn how to combine two tasks? If you've ever tried to play piano, you know that, when you first learn how to try to play piano, maybe you can only do one hand at a time, but then eventually you're able to read music, two lines of music, and one hand is doing one thing and one hand is doing another, and you can combine those two tasks. So we can do this, right? And so the attention hypothesis of automatization is that attention is needed during practice, and attention determines what gets learned. But then we can combine certain tasks. And maybe there's a little bit of switching back and forth that goes. So, researchers have tried to figure out like how much can you actually do with two tasks at once, or can you just do like one task at a time, but you're doing such fast switches between the tasks, and that's how you're doing it. The idea would be like you're reading the top line of music and you kind of process that for the right hand, and you're reading the bottom line of music and you're processing that for the left hand when you're playing piano. So automaticity and practice. With practice, what you know is that activities will require less and less cognitive capacity once you get better and better at them. Practice drivers who are really good at driving and have had a lot of experience of driving tend to drive on what we call autopilot. They don't need a lot of focused attention. They need attention for those unexpected events, but all the details about, okay, now I have to press the gas pedal, now I have to press the brake, now I have to turn my steering wheel. All those things when you're a beginning driver are all requiring your focused attention, but they become autopilot. They're in the background. Reading becomes automatic with practice. There are all kinds of things that we do that become practiced, and then we don't really have to use our attention. A great example that's used over and over again in the cognitive literature is Stroop. And I'm sure you've seen this before, but Stroop is a task where you're asked to name the ink color and ignore whatever word is typed out. So in the first top left, you have a stimulus that is the word red, but it's typed in blue ink. And so your task in a Stroop task would be to say blue, because that's the ink color. You just completely ignore the word. But the reality is, when you attempt to do this task, when you're trying to go as quick as possible and you're attempting to name the ink color, it's really difficult because reading is an automatic, well-rehearsed process, and it interferes with your ability to do the less practiced skill, which is naming the color. And so when you have a Stroop task, basically what you're doing is you're opposing the less common, less practiced skill with something that is more common, word reading, and it interferes with your ability to do the task. So what are the characteristics of automatic processing? Well, as you know, when you do things on automatic pilot, you're doing it without intention. You don't have a lot of conscious awareness of what's going on. You can do it in the background very easily, and it doesn't really interfere with other mental activity. As you know from being a seasoned driver, you're able to drive fairly easily. As long as the traffic's not too terrible or you're not driving in some unknown location, you can carry on a full conversation with the person in the car with you. In fact, you can have a fairly detailed conversation talking about decisions and everything while still driving. So that lack of conscious awareness tells you that their driving task is quite in the background. You don't need a lot of attentional awareness to do that. So how do you test this out in studies? This is one of my papers, and I think it shows you, for example, how you can ask people to do things in very, very simple studies with very simple stimuli to understand what's happening. So just like the Stroop task, you can present information and make different cognitive processes oppose or work together. So in this example, you have a first stimulus that is showing up. And these first stimuli in a trial is oftentimes called a prime. The first thing that you see in a study trial is a prime. And then another stimulus that you see, the second one, is often called a probe. And so you can look at, for example, in this study, there are two different colored rectangles that are in category 1 and two different rectangles that are in category 2. And you just give the subject the basic instructions. If you see category 1, press a key using your right hand. If you see category 2, press a key using your left hand. And so when you have a first stimulus from category 1 and then they get it again, oh, they're super fast because they have the same stimulus again, and then the repetition that they get is it's the same stimulus, it's the same response, and you have sort of the same process happening. But if you have the first stimulus in the same category, but the second stimulus in the same category, but it's a different stimulus, then you have sort of a jarring of, relying on, doing the same thing again versus thinking about a decision. Like, is this still in the same category? Like that decision process, that's a little bit more challenging for a subject than maybe switching to a new category. Just explain these studies again. So when you do a study like this, in these cognitive studies, what happens is that you'll have many, 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 many trials. Subjects might do 300 trials in a study, and what they're doing in these studies is different things over and over again. And we look at these different conditions to see if performance changes a little bit. So this picture shows you what a subject might see, starting in the top left. So they might first see a fixation cross telling you, okay, a trial's going to start, be ready. And then they might get a colored rectangle, which is called the prime, the first thing they show up. And then, so here they get a red rectangle, they press maybe with their right hand the response. And then the second stimulus here is a probe. The second item is a probe, and it's a green rectangle. So if it's in the same category, then they would press again with the right hand. But if it's in a different category, maybe they press with their other hand. So if red and yellow are in one category and blue and green are another category, then the first item would be a right hand press. The second item would be a left hand press. And then, maybe you'd give them some feedback and tell them that they're correct or not correct in doing the response. Once they go through that trial, there might be a brief break, and then you go through another trial. Maybe the next trial is red followed by yellow, and the next trial would be green followed by green, or blue followed by blue. You mix them all up. And that's how you can tell when processes are together, working together, or maybe opposed, and it's taking them longer to make a decision. Here's another example of a different kind of cognitive task. So in this task, a single number pops out against a background of letters, no matter how many letters are in the array. And so when you present stimuli like this, you're trying to figure out, like, is attention grabbed? Does attention see the change that is different among all the other stimuli quickly, or do you have to like take a lot of time and work your way through all the stimuli one by one to figure out, is there like something in the stimulus that's different, like a number instead of a letter? So when we do studies like this, that's when researchers come up with these ideas such as feature integration theory. And, the idea of feature integration theory is that we first notice individual features like color or shape. And then if you have to combine them and integrate them, that takes longer. So obviously that makes sense when you think of the brain. There are cells in the back of the visual cortex that identify color and angles and things like that. But integrating things together, color and lines, probably takes more of a higher order cognitive process to do that. And so, you can present stimuli in studies where you can rely on an individual feature to make the response, or you have to integrate them. And then if that integration has to occur, then the response time would be much slower, or maybe more error prone. So, controlling attention. Don't we all want to control our attention better? I think we do, right? We all want to be better at controlling our attention. Being really good at paying attention allows us to be a better student and a better employee and things like that. So, how do we do that? Well, one of the things that works really well is mindfulness meditation. That is the process of, kind of basically thinking about nothing and just being aware of your environment, staying focused on the moment and time. You can do all kinds of mindfulness meditation techniques. Sometimes it's just sitting quietly, trying not to think about anything. You can also do mindful listening, where you just like sit quietly and listen to all the sounds happening around you, or mindful looking at your environment. So many different techniques. And the thing that is interesting, by doing nothing, you're training your attention. So being comfortable with doing nothing, boredom, is actually, it seems counterintuitive, but by doing nothing, your attention is being in a process of training. So, that's really kind of an interesting thing about our brain. When we are so overwhelmed with stimulus and distraction, phones, videos, TikToks, Instagram, you know, news everywhere, everyone talking, TV on, watching videos, watching movies, that constant stimulation is really having terrible impacts on our ability to pay attention. So when you actually have to sit down and do schoolwork and read a textbook that maybe isn't so interesting, or write a paper or whatever that takes focused attention, you're having a worse and worse time doing that because you're constantly stimulated. So when you control your attention, and you can do this by mindfulness meditation or, other techniques, it's interesting because getting comfortable with boredom and being mindful actually correlates with higher life satisfaction. So, if you actually want to have a more meaningful life, have more satisfaction in life, then you actually want to be comfortable with boredom. It's also neurologically associated with the parts of the brain that are involved in paying attention, the prefrontal cortex. So if you have challenges in paying attention, doing techniques that help you grow your ability to pay attention, you'll actually see it in the prefrontal cortex in the front part of your brain. So it's worth, making the time and effort to try and train your attention a little bit. The brain also may have trouble paying attention if there's some sort of damage. And so, in various cases, you can see situations of sensory neglect where you fail to pay attention to part of the scene. So, patients with damage to their right parietal lobe, when they are given a model of a clock and then asked to draw it, like they'll miss part of the clock. They clearly can see, like they'll draw a full circle, but they are attentionally missing part of it. Same thing if you give them a picture of a house to draw and you say, draw this picture, they'll like miss out on part of it. It's like their attention the spotlight can't move to part of that scene for them. And it's attentional, not visual. because you can test other parts of their vision and they can see fine, but it's the attention part that is missing. Um, Also, there are certain situations, not just with brain damage, but certain situations where we know that we have limits of attention. So there are laws in place that often prevent us from using a cell phone while driving. And that is because there are extensive studies that have shown that, when you are engaged in a conversation with somebody and the other person on the line doesn't see the road, they continue to engage your intention in a way that could be dangerous. So, what's the difference between talking on a cell phone and sitting beside somebody in the car and having a conversation? Well, what they found is that when you are sitting with somebody in a car, if something unusual happens on the road, the passenger is watching you drive. They may not be fully paying attention, but for the most part, they kind of have a view of the road. So if there's something unexpected or unusual happening on the road, they stop talking, or they slow down talking, or they don't expect a quick response. But a person on a cell phone doesn't have that information about the environment. And so then more accidents are more likely to occur. And then, obviously, if you're texting, you're not even looking at the road. So there's a problem too. So probability of missing an event that could cause an accident. When you have a single task, you're able to monitor the environment for unexpected events much better. But when you are dual tasking, driving, paying attention to the road, paying attention to other drivers, and then you're doing another task on top of it that might absorb your attention, then you have all kinds of possibilities of causing accidents, and obviously sometimes fatal ones. So we just never want to text and drive for that very reason. Okay, so reviewing this very beginning introduction about attention. Attention is interesting, isn't it? It's a really flexible system. It can allow things to come in, like your name, but then you can miss like really obvious things, like, for example, someone walking by in a gorilla suit, you don't even see it. So it's really a flexible system. There are limits on the number of things that we can attend to at one time. Selective attention means that we can primarily focus on one thing at a time. Practice seems to change the amount of attention required for a task. This transition between needing to pay attention to not needing to pay attention, taking a process that is cognitive, that is a control type process that absorbs our attention, and then practicing so that we can move it to make it more of a background process, an automatic process. That's a really, really interesting learning mechanism that practice is needed. And some processes are in the background, they're automatic. They actually probably don't really require attentional resources. So getting up in the morning and going through your morning routine of brushing your teeth, making breakfast, getting dressed, you've done those things so many times that you probably don't even need to really pay attention to any one of those processes, and you'll still be ready to go in the morning. And attentional control can be improved. It can be improved with practice, but also attention can be improved if you engage in techniques like mindfulness meditation or getting used to feeling of boredom. Those sorts of things are also really good for your attention. So it's interesting. A lot of different strategies you can use to improve your attention, ranging from practice to doing basically nothing. So there you go. That's the end of attention.